only interested to look in the back, in the past, but it was more interesting and more convincing to see what's going on in the present. And with her we went to galleries, we went to collectors, so my interest suddenly changed into contemporary art. And from this point onwards I more or less was only concerned with contemporary art. This means that I also worked in a gallery, I gave lessons for adults and children, I worked in a newspaper, I started to make small exhibitions, writing some texts, all these things you do when you start a kind of career. And then I got a first job. After I made my MA, I wrote my MA about Francis Bacon, the British painter Francis Bacon, and I got my first job, and this was directly something in contact with young artists. I worked for the German Association of German Industries, and we gave prizes to young artists in different fields. So I started this in 1995, when a new generation of emerging artists also suddenly arises in Germany. So one can also say that I had quite a good luck, it was a lucky situation for me those days. So I started working very early with Wolfgang Tillmans and Thomas Dehmann, several artists, Kai Althoff, who made a big career, who became very famous during those days. And it was a new approach in the German contemporary art scene, because, as you know, the wall between East and West has come down, and Berlin became the new capital of Germany, of course, but also the new cultural capital. So there was, in 1998, there was the first Berlin Biennale, where artists you also see here in the show, like Ewan Bock and other artists, were shown their first works. So this was a kind of turning point, and in those days we also created the idea of Come In. The exhibition was put together in 1999, when there was this emerging new interest into the fields, what is design, what is interior, what is public space, private space, where all these questions suddenly emerges together, and what is the new pop cultural approach in Berlin. There were clubs arising, the WMF club, we say WMF club. There was this new music trend, techno, all over, and so this was a kind of change situation. And after this I went back to university and did my PhD about Peter Fischli and David Weiss, the Swiss artist duo. They have lots of humor, and they concentrated on sculptures and new media and also installations. And after this I worked as a director for an outdoor sculpture garden, private sculpture garden with outdoor sculptures, which is a different field from, in a way, making exhibitions inside in a museum, in an interior, because you have to face that the sky and the surrounding, it's always a bigger, much bigger dimension. Like the Parque Fundidora, you have the ground, you have how do people walk through a park, how do people feel in the park, so it's a little bit different field, but also contemporary sculptures. And then since 1 year now I work as a director in an art museum. It's close to Cologne. It's called Leopold Hirsch Museum, as you said, and there are in fact two museums. One museum is like a classical museum for art, and the other one is a paper museum. It's more like a cultural museum. So these two museums I want to combine with a new philosophy, because you can see nowadays, I think, that the borders which were there when I started studying art, you know, they had the field of art, you had the field of film, music, design. All these borders have blurred, and artists uses the material, uses the things they need to get their ideas in a new perspective. And I think this is also interesting probably to watch now this show. It's, you know, it's the 13th venue of the show. It traveled a long way, and one can say that it's now kind of historical already, which started to be contemporary in 1999. Now it became a classic, so to speak. And yeah, I think it's interesting that there are 25 positions in this exhibition. There are also positions just in this catalog. We have an insert at the beginning by Matti Braun. It shows photos from Namibia. There was a German colony. It was called Kohlmannskuppe, and they were looking for diamonds. And after all those years, this was found in 1908, after all those years it was taken over by the nature, by the sand. So you find now only like references to the old part. And it's interesting to put this at the beginning of the show, because it shows at the end that people are thinking all the time, how can I express myself, how can I give a comment on society, how can I give a comment on what is art, and all these questions. And at the end it's still this very classical dialogue also between art and nature, in between the human beings, the artist, who has to find or has to define his own role, his own way. And yeah, this is the reason why we put this as a kind of philosophical approach at the beginning. And we have another insert here by Eric Schmidt. It's called Home Story. And as I already said, at the end of the 90s, artists began to move to Berlin. It was very cheap. It's still very cheap to get a studio, to get a flat. And here you see, we call in German Plattenbau. And those were specially given to artists in the former DDR. And Eric Schmidt himself, here you see the artist, he moved in such a flat and made it up as his home. And at the same time, parallel to this, he made up this home story, pretending to be an artist, pretending to live in a very exceptional lifestyle. And what at first glance is art suddenly turned into reality, because TV companies were calling up. They wanted to make an advertisement spot there in this flat, and this home story turned out into to be in many magazines. So the criticism of advertisement, glossy magazines and all this stuff suddenly turned back into reality. But you also find other interesting characters here in this show, like Gregor Schneider. This is very interesting because I just worked again in Düren with Gregor Schneider, and I worked here in 1999 together with him, so I know him for many years. And in between he got the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale in 2001. As you know, he got this kind of normal house, German house, by his parents in Reit, and he started to rebuild, to restructure the house. So he put into new rooms, new doors, new windows, created a kind of claustrophobic atmosphere, very scenic atmosphere. And for the Venice Biennale, Udo Kittelmann was the curator of the German pavilion. They took out the whole house and shipped it over to Venice and then built it into the German pavilion. And this was amazing because suddenly you didn't have this big entrance, you had this very small door you could open, and you were standing in this typical German house, or in this Gregor Schneider's house. It's called Ur. And in this show, in this come-in show, the people can see the video he made himself with a small camera on his head, prowling through this house, going through this house. So I think this is one of the endpoints of what a sculpture can be, you know, that the body is part of this process of being a sculptural installation, that you as a person became part of this, you know. This is a kind of older idea if you think of people like Bruce Nauman and Joseph Beuys, the principle of participation, which probably occurs in the 60s and 70s, where now finally went to another point, but it's also always a question of aesthetics and the relation to aesthetics. And I think for all over the world, but also especially Germany, one big issue is modernism, or the question what is modernism? How can it function? So if you see this installation here by the Dankes brothers, they were, when they were children, their father was an architect in Aachen, which is close to Düren actually now, so it comes all together. They were thinking of themselves when they were children, how did the world look in our terms, you know, what does it mean, modernism. The principles and the rule of modernism, they still go on into our days still. And on the other hand, you have between those days and the 90s, where these artists are from, you have like the 80s, which created this kind of postmodernism, meaning very playful, very symbolic, very humorous approach towards art. Yeah, which in fact, if you think of the American art scene of those days, it came to kind of affirmative critique. Yeah. And so you find in this exhibition, coming back to this exhibition here where we are now, you find all these different kind of attitudes towards what is a sculpture, what is art, and how can art be function. So we also have this bar where people can sit, where people can talk. So in a way, art is about communication those days. Also, if you think about Tobias Rehberger, he asked friends, he asked people to work on an issue, and then he created afterwards this work. So, yeah. Great. And then suddenly in the 80s there came this, we say, new spirit in painting. There was this famous exhibition in London. We say Hunger nach Bildern, you know, thirst for new paintings, and painting again arises. And artists like Gerhard Richter, Sigmar Polke, and beforehand Georg Baselitz, Jörg Immendorf, suddenly painting was on vogue again after these years of more conceptual art. After also Joseph Beuys tried to establish his idea of a social sculpture, meaning that people come together, ideas come together, that new forms of materials also were used for installations, for art. And I think then after these 80s, this very heavy painting movement, again, it's conceptual art in the 90s, beginning of the 90s, were very strong because there was a new approach of the society looking with different eyes onto the art. Think of also movements which came from New York again, you know, AIDS and all these new issues were arising in the society. So you had young artists dealing with this. Then photography for the first time was established as an art issue. Think of Andreas Golsky, Candida Höfer, Thomas Struh, Thomas Ruff. There was a strong art scene now suddenly for photography, for big photos, special images coming up. Then a new generation of sculptures suddenly were there, like Katharina Fritsch, Thomas Schütte, the model, sculpturing as a model. There was a dialogue between commercialism, daily life, and art suddenly, yeah. But think also about this new approach concerning video and new techniques, very important as well. There were two schools, one school in Karlsruhe, the so-called ZKM, Zentrum für Kunst- und Medientechnologie, and on the other hand in Cologne, the School for Media Arts, was very new, that people make videos, photos, films even, and it was easier to get the technique to do these things. They have presidents like Marcel Odenbach. So it was a very emerging thing going on in Germany, and many of those artists, they're probably, I can't mention them all now, became professors nowadays at the academies and even became leading figures in the international art world. One must face that the international art world, since there are so many biennials, triennials, and there's so many art fairs now, it became more and more international because politics and of course also economics became more and more international. And former we had in Cologne, where I'm actually from, was one of the first art fairs at all in Germany, the Cologne Art Fair, the Art Cologne. The most important art fair is still probably in Basel in Switzerland, which is also close to Germany. So there was a very ongoing lively scene, especially between Cologne and New York, because dealers from Cologne went to New York and opened up galleries there. Other dealers from New York came to Cologne. So Cologne, Düsseldorf were highly attractive for artists. Think of movements in the 80s like punk, music, yeah. And this then 10 years later, techno. So I think art is not alone, you know, you always have to see the context of music, of film, of people who are dealing in the scene, who are working with this. And so I think that the German art scene learned a lot from what was going on in the Second World War and tried to overcome also this, which at the beginning was very difficult, of course, and very hard, because there was also kind of new generation, you know. There was a new generation of artists, they were young, they want the rebellion against the father generation, of course. And but I think people I've already talked about, like Sigmar Polke or Blinky Palermo, they're already dead, you know. And I think it's good now that nowadays we have this kind of globalized art scene, which is very interesting, so people can connect. We live in a Facebook generation. It's all very quick connected to other worlds, to other art scenes. You know, he tries to question his own life. Many approaches are, of course, biographically or autobiographically. Art tries to approach a society, art tries to approach history, art tries to approach political issues, art tries to questioning humor, you know, all these different fields come together. And I think what is very important is that probably what you want to know is how do people get always new approaches, or where are the different visions? I think it is by looking at other work by other artists. And as you know, we established a kind of Western standard, which is now, we should say, a kind of international standard. So people know how far did artists in the past go. How far can you go then paint a black painting? How far can you go as make like Malevich did? How far can you go as, for example, make up yourself as a sculpture, or include your body into the work like Joseph Beuys did, like a social sculpture? How far can you get like a reproduction of paintings like Andy Warhol did? How far can you go towards the question of probably put in yourself into a painting like Jackson Pollock did. So there are these kind of, how far can you go concerning distortion, like Pablo Picasso did, yeah? So there are all these kind of father and mother figures, or grandfather and grandmother figures. How far can you go then saying this is an artwork, like Marcel Duchamp did by writing, yeah? So you have this kind of art history. It's well known all over the world, and then you must think of something, or make up something very special, create your own approach towards it, create your own language, probably a language which is then again and again occurring. It probably doesn't matter if you also repeat yourself, because you can't work in all different fields. You have to develop your own style, your own attitude towards the things. And if it turns out to be very unique and very interesting, and if you find the right ways to present also your work, if you find the way into the art world, then you become one of these figures which made up art history. And the art is always seen also into waves, you know. At one point, something is very trendy, then suddenly 10 years later, you look at this and think, oh my God, you know, what was going on there, and why did, yeah. And, but it has a kind of historical moment in it, which was at this point very important, and which brought new ideas and brought new, a new perspective into art. And this is what art should be, and this is also what these 25 artists here try to do. On the one hand, it's a kind of entertainment, it's you should enjoy, but on the other hand, we have also things where you should think of what's going on. We have a room of the terrorist movement of the 70s, of the RAF, where Corpus Löffler, the two artists, they try to emerge into this scenery. They studied this. It was the terrorists, they needed money, and they wanted to rob a bank in 1977 in Bremen, and the artists, they put together all these things which were in this room, so they tried to show that the terrorists made an interior up with like a very normal life, so if the police would come in, they wouldn't think that the terrorists actually live in there. And at the same time with this installation there comes a video which the artists themselves made when they were children of 1977. And this shows the young kids playing with guns and shooting each other. So meaning that terror and all these kind of extreme situations where we live through nowadays, we have it all in ourselves, you know. We are all human beings, and we try also, when we are children, we play with this, yeah. And then when you become adult, you have to think of how to use this, how to use weapon, how to use your criminal, or how to become a criminal or how not, yeah. So, and how is our society structured in a way. So I think that this is also coming with this show, but there are also other aspects when the artists think of themselves, of their childhood, where have they been, what does school mean to them, and. So there are many various aspects.